Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where each week I answer a film-related question submitted by you, our BMFI viewers. This week's question: India and China both have huge film industries. Why don't we see more films from those countries coming to the United States? Well, this is a really good question, and its answers, I think, are by and large pretty kind of boring. The one answer is that Americans don't like subtitles. I can say this as someone who works at a theater that shows a lot of foreign language films. Um, the Even the most popular subtitled film um, attracts a fraction of the audience of a film that does not have subtitles. And dubbing doesn't do any better. I think that there are some valid reasons for um, preferring films that don't have subtitles, and I can certainly understand why people find dubbing distracting. We have been, for the subtitles, we have been told, and I think it is true, that film is a visual medium, and having our attention split between reading words on the screen while also trying to take in the visual information being conveyed can be a challenging endeavor. And for a lot of people, doesn't seem like fun, and it precludes the sort of suspension of disbelief and the kind of notion of being taken in by the movie if they're in the active process of reading and going back and forth between big picture image and subtitles. As for dubbing, which for a time was certainly in the 20th century was an acceptable sort of approach to different languages in movies. American audiences certainly, and I think audiences around the world, have been conditioned through years of improving technique and bigger budgets in filmmaking to expect seamless verisimilitude by and large. And it's just really hard to get past the notion that dubbing from one language to another, where the sounds don't match the lip movements, regardless of the language, it's hard to see how that won't, to a significant number of people at least, seem like a mistake, even though it's done on purpose and everyone understands why. On one level, when you're watching the film, it's very distracting and distancing. And again, like I was saying with the subtitles earlier, sort of prevents that kind of engagement that people tend to want with their films. So those are some basic reasons. I think beyond those reasons, there are just differences in the industries and cinematic traditions of those countries that make such movies difficult to fit into the sort of mold or the structure of the American film industry. A big one, certainly for Indian cinema, is the length of the films. Having a movie that is 3 hours or more from Hollywood is an exception rather than the rule. It used to be, I'll grant, it used to be a rarer exception than it is now, but it's still the exception. The majority of movies nowadays, I wouldn't say they're 90 minutes like they used to be. They're up over 2 hours, but they're not 3.5 or things like that. And in many other countries, film industries and cultures, that's very common, and India is one of them. And so I think that presents a sort of very practical stumbling block. I also think that though audiences will tell you that they crave originality and they like seeing things they've never seen before, there's a reason that film genres have existed throughout Hollywood history, and why, by and large, um, on at one level or another, film genres are still important to the American film industry. And it's not that the Chinese film industry or the Indian film industry don't have genres, they do, but they're different genres. And the decades of building up understanding the sort of unwritten contract of genre between Hollywood and American audiences, this would the movies from other countries certainly, but particularly from India and China that have um, that tend to take different generic approaches in many of their films. That would be a real that would be a real uphill battle. Um, the other thing I would say is that um, is to give it time. You know, I think that with Netflix and other streaming services, I can say anecdotally, I know a lot of people who are watching a lot more content from other countries than they used to, certainly than they were, 5 or 10 years ago. And I don't think it's impossible to imagine that um, that that sort of openness to or interest in um, visual programming from other countries and cultures might eventually make its way to movie theaters. I will say that there are places around the country, and including in our region, where films from other parts of the world that don't typically get sort of embraced by the American film industry and major American theaters do get a fair amount of showing. There are theaters in most major metropolitan areas that provide a study diet, for example, of Indian films. Anywhere there is a members of a national or cultural or ethnic diaspora, you will find some um, presence of that film culture in those areas. And that is certainly true for Indian cinema in many places in the United States. The last thing I would say is that, and this sort of relates to the opening up of the American eyes and minds via streaming services. The other thing I want to say is that um, good or bad, fair or not, um, Hollywood was sort of the first major film industry to go global, and it dominated that realm for a long, long time. Some would say it still does dominate that realm, with the biggest blockbuster movies making multiple $billion and showing around the world. But my point is that people in India and China, for example, in the question, have had decades, many, many decades to sort of incorporate American movies into their culture, into their society, into their film industries or the film exhibition industries. The same hasn't been the case for the cinemas of India and China in the United States. Now, I will grant you, it doesn't seem like we're sort of, particularly embracing that opportunity, but these things do take time, and it is possible that this question would have a very different answer in a decade or 2 decades. And it these things happen slowly. In many places around the world, for a time, at different points in the 20th century, the only movies to see, really, in a commercial sense, were American movies. And that laid the groundwork for the global audience those movies still have today. Other countries' film cultures developed later, developed differently, and their industries developed later and differently as well. And so, give it time. there may be a different answer to this question down the line. But it's an interesting question, and I appreciate it. If you have a film-related question you'd like to hear my thoughts on, please visit brynmarfilm.org, go to the Film Studies Online section, and find the Ask Andrew form. Who knows? Next time I could be answering your question.